this is part 4 of our analysis of fire death data. We're going to spend a little more time on pivot tables because they are so useful. So one of the things we didn't really do with pivot tables is any sort of math. We were doing counting of the rows in all of our previous pivot tables. But we could do things like averages. So we could, for example, to figure out the average age of the people who died each year. And because we do have an age column here, right? So we'll base this on the calendar year instead of those winters that we were doing. So we'll use this year column. So we're going to insert a new pivot table, and think about your question. What was the average age of the people who died each year? That, when you think about a question like that, that kind of defines how you're going to structure your pivot table. And also, it also kind of defines whether you need a pivot table or not, right? So you're doing a grouping situation, each year, and you're doing some math, the average age, that's your tip-off that you should use a pivot table. And then that grouping each year is going to be what goes in your rows. So we're going to put year in the rows. So we want an answer for each year. And sometimes you can kind of envision what you think this answer should be. And that can help you make your pivot tables. So then we want to know the average age. So we need to use age in the values box because that's where you do the math. The values box is always where you do the math. And so right now it's adding up all the years, all the ages. It's a lot of years of life lost. But if we can do the average right there. And if we want to get rid of all those decimal points, I'm going to highlight that and go up here to decrease decimal places up in the top menu. We can knock that down. Wow, middle age, lovely. We could also, it might be a good idea also we're going to put age back in values a second time. And it might be good to try this as a median. The rule of thumb is that an average can be easily tilted by big outliers. And the rule of thumb is to use if your average and your median are really far apart from each other, they're just very distinctly different, then you should use a median because that's an indicator that your averages are being skewed by an outlier or two. You can see here our averages and medians are very, very, very close to each other. So it's perfectly fine to use average because that's what people tend to understand. Readers understand an average. So this also does not look like things have changed much. I wouldn't read too much into 2018 average age of 42 because remember 2018 is only a partial year. It's 3 months of the year. And so it's a little skewed and could be tilted by a few too many children in there. So don't pay attention to that. And I think, yeah, we do have a full year in 2005. So these other ones are pretty good. Okay, so that's average age. If we go back to our main data, and another thing we could do, what's the average number of deaths per month? This is kind of like the season thing we did, but like which month has tended to have the most I think what we have to do first, let's do a pivot table here. If we put month in the rows, this is probably what would trip somebody up. If we did an average here, we can't actually average the column of the month. Do you see what it did? It's giving us just the number of that column because the number 12 is in that column. It's averaging the months. So we can't do that. But if we count the number in each month, and we need the year in here. We need the year and the month. And we can repeat the row labels. And we're going to take out the totals. Don't show the totals. So that unchecking these boxes over here under the rows, uncheck show totals and say repeat row labels. We've effectively made ourselves a new table that says, you know, here there were 2 people who died in the month of February in 2005, 5 in the month of February in 2006, 8 in 2007. So now we have a new table that we could average. So what I'm going to do is copy the contents of this pivot table. And sometimes this is what you need to do, is like you make a new data set. So we're going to copy this and add a new sheet. And there's a little add sheet button down in the lower left. I'm going to leave a row for our headers. So we're going to say this is the year, this is the month, and this is the number of deaths. It's a little unnerving that 2 there is also a 2. So now deaths by month, and maybe we want to call this a table or something like that for our own knowledge. Now if we want to average this, here's where we could do a pivot table on this and say I want the month, and then I'm going to put deaths in values, and we will average that. And so it's quite frightening that there is anywhere from 2 to 6 deaths on average per month. And this is going back a good number of years, right? So it's a pretty steady drumbeat of people dying. And December does stand out. That's a pretty considerable difference between the other months, and unfortunate considering the holidays. So that's so maybe now we call this deaths by month pivot. So I know that the difference between this table and this table, they go together. So one other thing we talked about is now pivot table 8, where we made this new table. This is something you could save it and name it if you want, or we could delete it. Either way, it depends on if you think you might need to go back and readjust it and redo it somehow. So your call here. I'm going to delete mine to get it out of the way. I'm not a huge fan of deleting, by the way. I should say that. All right, so one other thing we talked about is kids versus not kids. How many of these are kids, or what percentage of these deaths are kids in any given year? But right now we just have age. So I want to put them into buckets. A simple way would just be kids versus adults, right? I'm going to call this kids, adults. And again, we can look for a pattern here, and we could use an if statement. If E2 is less than 18, we'll label this kids, or we could say child. That would be a nicer way to say. And if not, we would say adult. Now this is presuming that there's not some other scenario like a blank or anything like that. It's a very black and white. So hopefully we don't have any blanks in here. I don't think we do. I think we have solid ages. Okay, so now that we've done that, we could do a pivot table, and we could say kids, adults as the rows, and we could also do that in the values, and it's counting, and we could say percent of grand total. So about 9% of the deaths are children, which is probably in line with the share of children we have in our population. That would be something you could look at. What percent of the total population is children? To be able to determine if that's a disparate number by any means, anything strange. So the other thing we could do, now here's where we could maybe do that cross tabulation I talked about, is let's say we put that kid, instead of kids and adults in rows, we put that in columns, and then we put the year in the rows. And then we need to adjust this show as. Let's just put it back to default first of all. So now this is a crosstab. So it's showing us in 2005, 36 were adults, 5 were children. In 2006, 40 were adults, 6 were children. So if we make this, we want to be a percentage, we would not do percent of grand total, because that would just give us the same answer. It would give us, it would say, it would take that 36 adults or the 5 children on that first row, and it would say, what's that 5 out of the 622 total deaths? So that's not what we want. But if we want to say, in each year, what percent were children, then we're operating on a row. So we're saying across this row, what is this expressed, this 5 expressed as a percentage? That's where this percent of row comes into play. So we say in 2005, 12% of the deaths were children. In 2015 and 2014, it was much higher, closer to 16%. And in those first 3 months of 2018, remember that's partial, there weren't any. So what does percent of column do? We read that differently. So this is going up and down now. So those 5 children back in 2005, they account for 8% of all the children who've died across all these years, going down. So this is a much less likely scenario, but there's times where you may need to do a percent of column. But you just need to think about what your columns and your rows represent when you're doing a cross tabulation like this. So in this case, it's more likely that we're going to do the rows. Notice that here's another thing about crosstabs. Notice I put, why did I put kids and adults column in the columns? The reason is because I knew there was only 2 values, either child or adult, whereas the year column has more values, all these years. So whichever thing has the more values, like it's very long, that's what you want going down, and you want your short thing going across. And that's just because of space on your screen, really, and being able to see everything. So that's a kind of a rule of thumb on cross tabulations. All right, the end. Thank you for watching.